First of all, Americans are like sheep. They never ask themselves questions. If we have a national debt of $6 trillion, yo. Did you ever ask yourself that question? Well, the national debt, well, what is it? Who do we owe? Where'd we get the money? What'd we borrow it for? What's the interest rate? Who are we paying back? It's growing $1,006,000,000 a day. How's it growing if we're not borrowing anymore? Thank you. But your Bible doesn't call it interest. Your Bible calls it usury. Here's what your Bible says. Exodus 22:25. If you lend money to any of my people that are poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as an usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. Neither shall you lay upon him interest. Here's what Thomas Jefferson said. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their money, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them, around the banks, will deprive the people of their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. There are three types of conquest. Number one, war. Captives hate and rise up against the aggressors, and it takes too much force and money to maintain a situation where you have taken a nation captive by war. Secondly, religious conquest. But by nature, religion lacks military force to regain control once the captives are disillusioned. The third form is economic conquest. Money's the bloodline of a civilized society. It's the instrument by which a product is sold or bought. Reduce the supply of money below the necessary levels to sustain trade. Reduce the amount of this in the system below the levels necessary to sustain the current trade, and you create a depression. In 1930, let me ask you a question. Did we not have farms? In 1930, did we not have factories? Did we have the greatest roadway system in the world at that time? Yes. Did we have the greatest communication system in the world at that time? Yes. Did we have the greatest opportunity of trade with oceans on both sides and water systems like the Mississippi River running through the width and breadth of this nation? Did we have ability to move our goods and services? Yes. Did we have transportation and roadways? Yes. What did we not? Did we lack workers? Then what happened? I'll tell you what happened. The bankers decided no more money for you. They got out of the stock market. I can give you the family names. They got out of the stock market the year before. Do you know all the money that was lost in the stock market as people began to sell their stocks one after the other, after the other, after the other, and stocks that were valued at $10,000 were selling for 15 cents? And then they had to make a run on the bank because the banks, the stock market had said, oh, I'll tell you what you can do. You can borrow on margin. In other words, you can buy, the economy's really good here in the late 20s. Here's what you can do. You can borrow on margin for stocks. You can buy a stock at $100 worth of stock. You can buy it for $10, and we'll lend you the other money to buy the stock, and the stock is skyrocketing, so you stand to make a great profit. What they didn't tell the American people, and what you still don't know today, is that when they did that, they also put into that legislation that they would have a 24-hour recall. In other words, however much stock you bought, it would make a lot of money, but they could call that stock in, and you would be required not only to pay for the stock, but to pay for what you borrowed at interest from them. In other words, now you got to pay the $100 that they loaned you, but they're the ones that are calling it in. So when they called it in, you didn't have the money to pay for it, so you ran to the bank. but the bank only keeps 20% money on hand. They loan the rest of it out, so only 20% of the people could get any of their money out of the bank. So the banks collapsed, the stock market collapsed, all at the whim of the bankers who decided they wanted to make the money. I'm going to continue. Can I continue? We didn't lack industrial capability. If you don't believe me, I just told you what started the Great Depression. Let me tell you what ended it. World War II. And all of a sudden, the same banks that said no money for farms, no money for food, put people in soup lines, no money for commerce, no money for railroads, no money for roads, no money, no money. All of a sudden said, war? And all of a sudden, factories that were closed down began to work 3 shifts. Where'd the money come from? The same pockets that refused to give it before. Because they decide when it will be printed, how much will be printed, and how much usury or interest will be paid. Not the federal government. The federal government has no say in it. Here's how it works. They print it, we borrow it, and we pay them interest. This is a private company. This is an independent corporation and group of bankers. So when you hear the news say, the Fed decided that the interest rate will go up, how do they get to decide? They get to decide because in 1913, Woodrow Wilson, he was elected, he was in honor of 1913, he signed the Federal Reserve Act, bringing the Federal Reserve System into place in America, and did what Thomas Jefferson said must never happen. He took the control of the money away from the people by taking it away from the Congress and gave it to a group of private individuals. Here's how it works. Let's say the government, which always needs money, because it always spends more than it is able to collect in taxes. So the federal government needs $1 billion. Since they can't create the money, because in 1913 they gave that responsibility and they gave that authority to the Federal Reserve, they have to go to, our government has to go to the Federal Reserve and ask them for the $1 billion. Well, since the Federal Reserve is a private corporation, they're not about ready to just give their money away. So they say to the government, we will loan you the $1 billion for your agreement to pay it back with interest. But now wait a minute. The government doesn't have the ability to create the money. The Federal Reserve creates the money. Congress tells the Treasury Department, the Fed will loan us $1 billion, print $1 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Those bonds are given to the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve said, we'll loan you the $1 billion plus interest. But it only prints the $1 billion. So the interest payments are never created and put into the system. So how is the government ever going to pay them back? They didn't have the $1 billion to begin with. If they didn't have the billion, then they didn't have the billion plus interest. So they get given the billion, but they can't pay the interest because the interest money was never created and put in the system. That's how it's growing $1.6 billion a day. We can't pay the interest. The money is not in the system. How many of you agree that's awful and that shouldn't be? They shouldn't be able to, put in $1 billion and take out the billion plus the interest money, because more is being taken out of the system than is put in the system, keeping the people enslaved to the tune of $7 trillion. The Federal Reserve Board has been in operation in this country since 1913. They have never been audited one time. Do you see that we've been taken captive? That's all I'm trying to... My whole point, somebody asked me, Pastor, why are you sharing that? My whole point is to let you know you're in bondage and don't know it.